Smile. Hello, my name is Samantha Hill. I'm the Assistant Director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities here at Bard College. Welcome to our virtual reading group. So this summer we are reading Hannah Arendt's The Life of the Mind. We're reading Thinking. And this week we have sections 11 and 12 on thinking and doing, the spectrum, and language and metaphor. And this is going to pick up where we left off 2 weeks ago, talking about the activity of thinking, and she's going to start in these sections transitioning to her conversation about thinking, how thinking appears in the world as an activity. So we're going to start to get into the question of language here. So I want to just start at the top of thinking and doing and work through some of the primary concepts and arguments that Arendt is laying out for us here. I'm in this edition on page 92. So I'm just going to read the first two sentences. She says, I have been speaking of the special predicaments of thinking that may be ascribed to the radicalism of its withdrawal from the world. By contrast, neither willing nor judging, though dependent on thought's preliminary reflection upon their objects, is ever caught up in these reflections. Their objects are particulars, with an established home in the appearing world, from which the willing or judging mind removes itself only temporarily and with the intention of a later return. So she's going to begin here by situating thinking in relationship, willing and judging, but picking up where we left off last time by reminding us that thinking is a form of withdrawal from the material realm of appearances, from the realm of worldly affairs, and that thinking always deals with invisibles, with those sense perceptions that we have from our experiences in the world, which we represent to ourselves in thinking. But she emphasizes in the beginning here that it's not a withdrawal from the world altogether. And she's going to reiterate this a couple of times in these sections, and this is very important for Arendt, because unlike Hegel or Plato, who tried to liberate man from the world of appearances altogether toward a realm of truth or ideas in a certain sense, she wants to situate thinking as an activity that is a form of withdrawal from the realm of appearances, where we appear before one another and are recognized by one another, but where we still remain in the world. We still remain on earth. We still remain in the world. And so Arendt adds in this opening passage for comparison that willing and judging are going to rely upon thinking's preliminary reflections, upon the objects of thinking, those experiences that we represent to ourselves. And I think it's important because she brings it up almost kind of like a bracket in these sections here to add that this relationship between thinking, willing, and judging, which she's laying out across the 3 volumes, is in part how she gets to the thinking that it has a capacity to prevent evil doing in the world. So moving through this first section then, what the activities of thinking, willing, and judging have in common for Arendt is what she calls a peculiar quiet, right? So we get this sense of solitude, of withdrawal, of stepping back from the action or the play. It's an absence of doing. So thinking is going to be a kind of a peculiar quiet, an absence of doing, an absence of action. And she writes in this opening paragraph, the withdrawal from involvement and from the partiality of immediate interests that in one way or another make me a part of the real world is a prerequisite for judgment. And so judgment is, for Arendt, dependent upon our ability to withdraw from the action, to withdraw from the world of appearances. There's a great line at the beginning of Adorno's lectures on the problems of metaphysics, where he says that the problem today is that everybody wants to be a joiner, and that the real difficulty comes about when people want to step back and just think. And Arendt is moving us to that space where we can step back and thinking so that we might be able to judge in relationship to the world around us. And this is going to relate to the distinction she's going on to draw between the spectator and the actor, and the difference between opinion which belongs to the performer, who needs the approval of the audience, and the possibility of truth, which is going to be possible for the spectator who step back from activity. So she argues that withdrawal from the world is one of the oldest conditions that has been posited for the life of the mind. And she says that the earliest example that we have of this is in the figure of the spectator, who was removed from the realm of action. And she's talking about Aristotle, and she goes to Scholle. And Scholle, in Aristotle's terms, she says, was the deliberate act of abstaining, of holding oneself back, shying from appearing from the ordinary activities determined by our daily wants in order to act out of leisure. And then she gives us this example on page 93 of Laertes, who says, life is like a festival, and the best people come as spectators. So the spectator, the theatai, shares the same etymological root as theoria, theory, which is a form of contemplating, looking upon something from the outside, from a position of distance, that allows us to have a better view of it, and allows us to see what is hidden from those who are immediately caught up in the spectacle and in the action. So the distinction between thinking and doing for Arendt is that the spectator may understand the truth of what the spectacle is about, but the price for truth is withdrawing from the play, right? So there's a decision of sorts in that, but it's not, again, I say this every time we talk about Arendt, Arendt's conceptual distinctions, which she relies on to make her argument, aren't hard and fast. Remember, she says in the panel Hannah Arendt on Hannah Arendt that all thinking moves from experience. So it's not that some people are philosophers and entirely removed from the world, who have access to this truth, even though they never participate in the world. It's that we go out into the world. You know, we are part of the play. We experience the world, but then we withdraw from the world. We withdraw, and it's in that activity of withdrawal that we engage in this self-reflective, critical thinking, where we can represent those experiences to ourselves and we can engage them in contemplation. And she says the withdrawal of judgment is different from the withdrawal of the philosopher. It does not leave the world of appearances. So we never leave the world of appearances like the philosopher might try to do, but we retire from active involvement in it to a privileged position. He puts on his robes and he talks with the ancients, right? Which is a really nice image of what Arendt is in part describing here. So she moves from here to a concept that's very important to her conception of thinking, which is Kant's enlarged mentality. Right? So even is not directly participating in the play. They are not solitary. They are not alone. They are in conversation with others. And this is, again, you know, the line from Cato that she's constantly going back to, that, you know, never are we less alone than when we are by ourselves. So on page 96, jumping forward a little, she says it is not through acting, but through contemplating that the something else, namely the meaning of the whole, is revealed. And so she's engaging in a play here, a kind of movement from the philosopher who engages in thinking, contemplating on the object of contemplation that can bring about truth, to this idea of the spectator who engages in thinking in order to find meaning. So she's moving us from the concept of meaning in thinking about what it is we are doing when we're engaging in the activity of thinking, when we're representing these experiences to ourselves, when we're telling stories to ourselves about our experiences, when we share those stories to others through language. What we're doing is creating meaning. And meaning, I might posit, for provocation is more important than truth here for Arendt. So the spectator, not the actor, holds the clue to the meaning of human affairs. And it is important for Arendt to emphasize that it's Kant's spectators, which exist in the plural, right? For Hegel, who wants to remove himself from the world of appearances, the spectators only exist in the singular, and it's the philosopher alone who becomes the organ of the absolute spirit. So the mind's withdrawal is a necessary condition for Arendt for all mental activities. And this is where she pivots us to the question of place, to space and thinking, which is really important to the life of the mind. And so where are we absenting ourselves to when we engage in thinking? Right? So if we're withdrawing from the realm of appearances, where are we withdrawing to? And she emphasizes on page 97 that the region of withdrawal is located within our ordinary world. Right? So we're not leaving the world. And so where are we when we think? And she says Plato is the only one who attempted to answer this question in The Sophist. And he answered, not in a satisfactory way for her, home in the darkness of non-being. And so she says if somebody were to write a history of inner life, a history of our inwardness, it would ultimately be a history of will. And then she kind of leaves that there, but of course that becomes the second section of the life of the mind. And so now we're at this place in the text where she's asking us, where do we go when we think? But then there's also this other question, which is how does thinking appear? If mental activities, thinking, willing, judging, are invisible, and they're occupied with invisible things, then how do they manifest? How does thinking appear in the world? How is it made visible? And for her, the answer is speech. So if we go to page 98, I will just read the first two sentences of the second section on language and metaphor. Mental activities, invisible themselves and occupied with the invisible, become manifest only through speech. Just as appearing beings living in a world of appearances have an urge to show themselves, so thinking beings, which still belong to the world of appearances, even after they have mentally withdrawn from it, have an urge to speak, and thus to make manifest what otherwise would not be a part of the appearing world at all. Right? So we have an urge to speak because we are thinking beings, and because we're appearing beings, which is, was the discussion of Portman chapters earlier. Because we appear in the world, we have an urge, a desire to be seen, to appear before others, and because we're thinking beings, we have an urge to speak. And so it's not our soul for Arendt that demands speech, it's our mind. Our mind demands speech. And words are not true or false. Words carry meaning. Words carry meaning. And she says logos is speech in which words are put together to form a sentence that is totally meaningful by virtue of synthesis. So words are meaningful in themselves, and thoughts resemble one another for Arendt. And implicit in our urge to speak is the question for meaning, not the question for truth. So because we're thinking beings, we have an urge to speak. And for Arendt, that urge to speak represents our urge for meaning. We desire to make meaning, to find meaning from these experiences that we have in the material realm of appearances, in the sensual realm of appearances. And it's not a quest for truth. So language is a form of communication between us, and we have this need of communicating our thoughts. And this here echoes with Arendt's conversation of plurality, which is embedded throughout much of her writing, that we have this fundamental need to communicate with one another, but also that our fundamental human condition for Arendt is plurality, that it is men and not man that inhabit the earth and make the world together. And out of this, we have a need communicate to one another. There's also something that I was reminded reading here. I think she gestures toward it, but she doesn't mention him in Rousseau's second discourse on the origin of inequality in part one, before the institution of society, he talks about man in the state of nature gesturing wildly because he has this inherent compulsion to communicate his inner life outwardly to those around him, even though there is no speech yet. So, but for Arendt, this is not enough. The gesturing alone, she says, thinking takes place in words. Thinking always takes place in words. And here we have then on page 101, page 100 to 101, she talks a little bit about character languages, which she says she's not really qualified to discuss, and neither am I. I do not speak a character language. But that there is a difference in thinking when the language, the meaning of the word is an image instead of language in the English sense. She wants to draw a distinction there. So I am just going to slip past that. We can come back to it if you want to talk about it. On 101 and 102, she talks about poetry. And she talks about the importance of poetic language. And she says, our mind's faculty of dealing with invisibles is needed even for ordinary sense experience. And she says, poetry, therefore, even if read aloud, will affect the hearer optically. He will not stick to the word he hears, but to the sign he remembers, and with it to the sights to which the sign clearly points. So poetry for Arendt, as she says in The Human Condition, is that form of language which is closest to the thinking activity itself. And metaphor, which is a kind of imagistic representation of language which carries meaning, which allows us to relate to it, connect to it, is best suited to this. Somebody flipped their mic. I'm not sure who it is though. So she says on 102, language is the only medium through which mental activities can be manifest not only to the outside world, but to the mental ego itself. And here she's going to talk about metaphor for a little bit. And she says, all philosophic and most poetic language is metaphorical, but not in the simple sense of the Oxford Dictionary, which defines metaphor as the figure of speech in which a name or descriptive term is transferred to some object form. And so she says, this naming is important. The atomistic gesture of naming that we engage in is a way of disalienating. She uses the phrase disalienating, which isn't very eloquent, but is a form of into us. But she says this isn't quite what metaphor is doing in thinking as a mode of language that facilitates the activity of thinking. She says the metaphor provides the abstract imageless thought with an intuition drawn from the world of a function is to establish the reality of our concepts, and thus undo, as it were, the withdrawal from the world of appearances that is the precondition of our mental activities. So she's defining metaphor here as a transfer, as a literal carrying over. Metaphor makes the invisible activity of thinking, which deals with invisibles, visible to the realm of appearances. So I was reminded of her introduction to Walter Benjamin in the volume of Illuminations, where she says, the difficult thing to understand about Benjamin is that he was a poetic thinker without being a poet. And so he understood that metaphor is, the most important form of language. So one of the things that Arendt is doing, and she's going to move us towards a metaphor for thinking, and that's what we'll talk about in our next session. She'll ask, is there a metaphor for the activity of thinking? Is she transforms aphorisms and metaphors into conceptual categories as a way of thinking about the world, which is again a kind of rebellion against philosophy. So philosophy molds its concepts proper from the transcendental realm of ideas. Then those concepts are not going to help us understand the world around us. They're not going to help us understand the world of appearances. In Arendt's language, they're not going to help us come face to face with the world as it is. But what Arendt is doing here is she's showing us a way to take those experiences from the realm of appearances, those central experiences in the world, and to transform them into metaphors, which she shapes into concepts for thinking about the world around us, which allow us to better come face to face with the world of appearance, with the world that we live in. My favorite example of this is her use of René Char and his collection of wartime poetry, Hypnos Waiting, which she ends on revolution with, begins between past and future with, and quotes here in The Life of the Mind. And she takes his idea of our inheritance was left to us by no testament in order to think about her concept of the loss of tradition and authority in modernity. And she takes his idea of the lost treasure of revolution to talk about what it is that was lost in the founding of the American Republic, and to offer us an example of political happiness and what it means to engage in action. And so she's looking to poets for language, for metaphors, in order to think conceptually. And so then just sliding toward the end, because I've been talking for a while and I see there are comments to open it up. She says, language, by lending itself to metaphorical usage, enables us to
Could you give us the
that
page
is
you're
to
on?
have traffic. I'm on 110.
Okay, thanks.
Language, by lending itself to metaphorical usage, enables us to think, that is, to have traffic with non-sensory matters, because it permits a carrying over, a metaphorein of our sense experience. There are not two worlds because metaphor unites them. And so she's turning to language, poetry, metaphor here in order to, again, engage in that process of what she calls dismantling metaphysics, pushing against the so-called the two-world theory, which is where she started The Life of the Mind.